Just going to make sure before I start that I'm on the screen and we're good to go. Hey. Okay, morning everybody. Oh, thanks. I want to share with you guys something that's been really challenging me over the last few months. And it's really brought home quite a few truths about things that maybe I wasn't really that aware of. And I don't know if you guys have ever come across any ideas or concepts that have really just clicked with you and changed the way you view relationships or life perhaps. And for me, an example of that was love languages. And that was so revelatory, and I don't know if you've heard of love languages, but it just changed the way I knew and understood relationships. Now this morning, what I want to talk to you about is shame. And it comes from a book that was recommended to me. And you can see that up there. And the author, Brené Brown, is a Christian. She grew up in the church. And what she writes in this book is just such incredible truth. And I know shame's not quite as cozy and nice as love languages, but I want us to be really real about how shame, in all shapes and sizes, affects our relationship with God and how it really stops us from experiencing the true freedom that He has for us. So shame, according to Brené Brown, is universal. It's a basic, primitive emotion that we all experience. And all of us are afraid to talk about it. But that's not actually good, because the less that we talk about it, the more control it has over our life. Now, we know that we are designed for relationship and to connect with each other. We're designed to belong and to experience love. And what shame does is it causes us to fear disconnection. And Brené Brown's description of shame and how she talks about it is that shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. We know that is not God's truth for us. And so what shame does is it drives this wedge between us and God, and it stops us from having healthy relationships. Now, I believe that the enemy likes to use shame and that he twists things. And what can happen is that he twists it so that we believe that we're not worthy of love and that we don't belong and that we're not good enough. And what can happen is that perhaps when we do something wrong, or maybe somebody does something wrong against us, is we can experience guilt. And we know that we're all guilty of sin. But when that's twisted, or when that starts to become something that we accept, or we believe and it becomes a part of our identity, that can become shame. So effectively, guilt is, I did something bad, but shame is, I am bad. Now in Psalm 23, verse 7, it says, "For as a man thinks within himself, so he is." Now, when we accept shame and we believe it, we start to behave from out of that belief. And I think that what it can do is it can influence our thoughts and maybe the choices that we make or the things that we don't choose to do. Now for me, before I started reading the book, I thought I had dealt with all of my shame. Before we moved to Malvern, we lived in Exeter, and I spent quite a lot of time praying about things. I had quite a lot of issues that I brought to God. And so when we moved here and when we came to this church, I was in a really good place. I felt really healthy. And so over the last few years, as things have popped up, I've kind of accepted them, I've managed them, and I've been like, my life is good, I can function with them in. And then I read this book, and it just made me realize, oh, actually, that's maybe not quite right. And for those of you that don't know, I work in a secondary school in Worcester as a safeguarding officer and a pastoral manager. But that's not actually what I'm trained in, that's not my background. I actually work in, well, I have a second job, you could say, in sports psychology. And when I was qualifying and when I was training, I had to do this big portfolio submission, and part of it was that I had to write a case study. And at the time, my supervisor suggested that I look to publish it in a case study journal. And I was like, no way, that's not happening. I am not an academic and I really hate writing. I was like, this is good enough. That'll do. We'll just leave it there. But anyway, she pushed me out of my comfort zone, and last year I submitted it to a case study journal to see what might happen. And I spent quite a bit of time on it, and before the summer, I found out that it had been accepted with some minor revisions, which was really cool. So I worked on it some more, my supervisor spent a lot of time on it, and it took quite a long time before I received the outcome. And it was actually a month or two ago that I found out that it was rejected. And so obviously I was really disappointed. And I'd had some positive reviews from the reviewers, but the editor had reviewed it as well, and he kind of just slated it. And at the end, he said this: "I hope the outcome of this specific submission will not discourage you from the submission of future manuscripts." And I was like, well, that's exactly what you've just done. No way am I putting myself out there again. And at the same time, what was happening was I was thinking about picking up sports psychology work again because I'd taken a year off to have Olivia. And there'd been a potential client who I thought would be good to go get back in touch with. And we'd had some discussions over email, and they'd showed interest, but then they didn't get back to me. So a few months ago, I thought, I have no shame in my life. And what happened was I realized a couple of things. One was, I didn't tell my supervisor that my case study had been rejected. And I hadn't got in touch with the client because I just thought I was going to get rejected again. And what I realized was that shame had a grip on my life. And I hadn't told my supervisor because I was afraid. I was scared of what she would think of me. And it was also reinforcing my beliefs that I'm not an academic and that I don't belong in that area and I shouldn't be trying to pretend to be something that I'm not. So what I'd done is I just left them. I completely avoided them, and I just kind of was like, okay, and I just sort of walked away from them. So I realized that shame really paralyzes me, and it stops me from pushing doors, and it stops me from putting myself out there. Now, I don't think that I'm the only one who's ever been afraid or held themselves back, felt like they're not loved, or that they don't belong. And I wonder how many of us accept shame or are perhaps living with shame, however big or small it might be. And I think that maybe the reasons that we are afraid to talk about it is because we think we haven't got the time to deal with it, that it's just too messy, it's too inconvenient, and actually shame is so painful sometimes that it's just going to hurt too much. I do not believe that is God's truth for us. God promises us a full life and a free life. So if we're going to have this full free life, there is absolutely no room for shame in that. And when I was reading about this and when I was trying to find stuff in the Bible to really sum it up, I came across 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and it reads this: "Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. But their minds were made dull, for to this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed, because only in Christ is it taken away. Even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." Now for me, this sums up how shame affects our relationship with God and with others. And I was like, oh my goodness, what if we replace the word veil with shame? It shows how shame blocks our vision from seeing and understanding God's truth. And for Moses and the Israelites, it stopped them from experiencing God's goodness. But Paul here is saying that God takes the pain of our shame away. That pain, our shame, if we give it to God, is gone. And what Jesus did on the cross is he replaces that sin and he replaces that shame, and God gives us instead freedom and love. And I just think that is just such a completely ridiculous deal, that we get given freedom and love in replace of our sin and shame. It's just gone. And I can personally account for that, because for a long time, so when we were in Exeter and I was dealing with my stuff, I carried around a real heavy shame that actually I didn't deal with it for I think it was about 15 years. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's anybody here who's maybe carried something for even longer than that. And what I was doing was I kept squashing it down every time it popped up, and it would come up again, and I was like, stop it, go away. And I just couldn't get myself into a place of dealing with it. And God would nudge me, and we know how the Holy Spirit just nudges us and guides us, and I was like, no, thank you. And he would do it again. I was like, no, thank you, I don't want to deal with that. But when I did, and when I did get myself to a place and I brought it to God, his love and his grace is just so powerful, and yet he is also just so completely gentle. And what I found as a result was that I was really deeply healed. It changed my relationships. I experienced such freedom in forgiveness. And it was literally like this physical weight was lifted off me. And I had this confidence in myself and in God. Now, I'm free from all of that, and that shame has no effect on my life anymore. But what it looks like to me now is that because I'm a mum to Olivia, I'm really conscious of what she absorbs from us, and that I want to be a good role model to her. Now, when I said about my case study earlier, that's not going to change Olivia's life. But what do I demonstrate to her if I give up? I know that if I don't try, I'm not going to gain anything from it. But if I do try, I don't know what opportunities that might open up for me later on. Now, I will tell you, I did contact my supervisor because I realized that if I'm talking about this, you have to actually do it. So I did get in touch with her, and she was really encouraging. And actually, I didn't have to be scared of what she thought of me, and I am going to give it another go. So for me, dealing with shame is like this continual journey that I go on with God, where I give him the stuff, I give him my sin, I give him my shame, and he replaces that with his freedom. So this is what I've learned with a little bit of help from Brené Brown. Firstly, we have to own it. We have to acknowledge and we have to understand that living with any amount of shame in our life is not going to bring us the freedom that God has for us. And you can see that in Genesis, Adam and Eve experienced shame. Adam tried to hide himself, and he was too afraid. And I think we all can at times try and cover things up with our own fig leaves. But that's not really dealing with it. It's just a coping mechanism. And it's not going to bring us true freedom. So when we're aware and when we know how shame can affect our lives, then we can deal with it. For me, the deeper my shame that I carried, the harder I found it was for me to name it. And actually, the biggest thing I've ever dealt with, I found so unspeakable that I couldn't even name it myself. And what I did was that I was with a trusted Christian friend who's actually a counsellor, and she was the one that named it for me. And once it's out there, once it's named, it's like, oh my goodness, the relief and the release that it brings just breaks all the power that it has. Because when we speak out and when we name it, it cannot have a hold on us. We can't pretend that it's okay. We can't try and hide it anymore. We have to deal with it. And so dealing with our shame, we have to be able to express our emotions and allow healing. And I found that at times that's not something that we can rush, and that we need to do that in a safe space. And sometimes we need others to get alongside us and help us. And I believe that the enemy really wants us to think that we have to keep it hidden and we have to keep it in the dark. But when we do, that controls us. And we need to name it. We need to speak it out. But we also need to be forgiven. We need to receive God's forgiveness and forgive ourselves. And we need to forgive others. And in Psalm 34, we see and we read that when we give that to God, he frees us from our fears. And we can be radiant with joy, and we don't have to hide in this shadow of shame. And when we deal with it, we can enter into the new thing that God has for us. Brené Brown talks about changing the story and changing the ending. And we can do that and not let shame be the dictator of our lives and control our lives. And if we let God author that, then we can experience healing. We can overcome challenges and we can move forward. And Hebrews 12 talks about some of this, and thank you, band, because I thought the worship was incredible at just declaring this truth. Because if we're running this endurance race, any weight that we carry is going to slow us down and is going to trip us up. And we have to keep our eyes on Jesus, because he endured the cross and he took that sin and he took that shame, so we can have that freedom and we can live really, really, truly free. I want to ask you guys a couple of questions. What if we all lived free from shame? If we removed the fig leaves and just bared all, what difference would that make in your life? What difference would that make in your life and those around you? We're going to have the opportunity to pray in a little bit. And I said earlier that I'm a safeguarding officer, and I have seen and heard a lot of things. If anybody wants to pray about anything and you think, oh, that's too much, that's too big, I don't care. And anybody else, Mike, whoever else is going to be available to pray, we do not care what it is. And I will say that you don't have to go into all the details, because when I dealt with some things, I named it and I put some context around it, but I didn't give every single little bit of detail. But naming it is really important, to bring it before God and speak it out so that we can deal with it. And I think when we pray, it's good to kind of maybe have a plan if you don't feel comfortable doing it today, but find somebody who you know is that safe person, somebody who you can trust if you feel you need someone to help you and get alongside you with it. But before we do, I just want to read something to you, and it's 2 Corinthians 3 again, but this time it comes from the Message. And I want you all to just close your eyes and imagine this for yourself. Whenever, though, they turn to face God as Moses did, God removes the veil, and there they are, face to face. They suddenly recognize that God is a living, personal presence, not a piece of chiseled stone. And when God is personally present, a living spirit, that old constricting legislation is recognized as obsolete. We're free of it. All of us. Nothing between us and God, our faces shining with the brightness of his face. And so we are transfigured, much like the Messiah, our lives gradually becoming brighter and more beautiful as God enters our lives and we become like him. Nothing between us and God, our faces shining, our lives gradually becoming brighter and more beautiful.